Hey guys, I'm out here working on the 85 K10, and today I'm going to be walking through the process for how I did the gear swap in my Dana 44 front axle. This is a 10 bolt front. It's used on pretty much all the half-ton square body trucks. I already upgraded the rear to a 373 with the Eaton posi, so now I am doing the front gear train. So first step in this process, of course, get the truck up on jack stands, get your wheels and tires pulled off, and that'll give you the access that you need to get the axle shafts pulled out of the trucks. So I'm starting here on the driver's side. You got to pull off the dust cap. It has 6 Allen head bolts that are holding it in place. So once you get that pulled off, you'll have access to the auto locking hub assembly. You need a pair of needle nose pliers, and there's like a spring mechanism that holds this in place. So you compress those 2 ears on that auto locking hub assembly and you just pull it straight out. Once you have that out, there is a snap ring in place. So you want to get that snap ring pulled out. And then this is the socket you want to use for removing the hub retaining nuts. There's 2 of them. This socket has the 4 ears on it that'll allow you to engage that nut and get it rotated out of there. There is a washer that's directly in front of that nut that'll come out with it. You can see that here. So that's behind the snap ring, and then next you have your outer retaining nut. Once you get that out, there is a spacer that goes between the 2 nuts, and you can see that here. You can use a pair of needle nose to get that out, and then you reinsert your socket and rotate out the inner retaining nut for the rotor assembly. And generally there's going to be a lot of grease on these parts, so sometimes getting them out can be a little bit of a pain because things stick up in there, but that's your inner retaining nut for the rotor assembly. And here you can see how it fits in that socket. Alright, so the next step is to remove your brake calipers. That way you can get the rotor pulled off of there. There's 2 Allen head bolts that hold that in place. Once you get that off, set it up to the side and pull the rotor off completely. See, I'm wiping off some of the grease that's left here. And then there are 6 nuts on the inside of your dust shield that have to be completely removed. That way you can pull the dust shield off. Alright, now you've got access to your spindle. This is the last component before you can remove your axle. You can see I took a dead blow hammer and just smacked it a few times to loosen it up. Pulls right off, and then your axle shaft slides right out. Alright, and the process is the same for the passenger side, so I'll kind of breeze through that quickly here now. So with the axle shafts removed, now I'll take the cover off the differential itself. You can see the 10 bolts that surround the cover, hence the 10 bolt reference. I'll leave 3 of those bolts on there. I just have them loosened up enough to where I can drain the gear oil out of the differential. Then remove the rest of those bolts, pull the cover off. Now you go around to the back side and we want to remove the drive shaft. There are 4 7/16 bolts that hold that in place. So you want to get those 4 bolts removed, and once you get the collars removed, I just zip tie the drive shaft up and out of my way. And now you've got access to your pinion nut. Now there's quite a few different companies that make these pinion yoke wrenches, so you can look these up on Amazon or Summit or anywhere, but you can use the 4 7/16 bolts that you pulled out to get this adapter in place that allows you to hold the yoke while you loosen your pinion nut. So you can see here I've got the breaker bar just resting on my spring perch as I'm loosening the pinion nut itself. Once I've got that loose enough, comes all the way off, I can remove the adapter, get that nut off, and then I take a dead blow just to tap the yoke until it's completely off. Alright, so the next step is you got to get the tie rods out of the way, that way you can get the carrier pulled. So you can see here I got the cotter pin out and I'm removing the nut that holds the passenger side tie rod. Same thing on the driver side, get your cotter pin pulled, loosen the nut, give it a few smacks to get that thing loose. And then same thing with that stabilizer shock that goes between the axle and the tie rod. You want that removed. That way you can completely drop the tie rods out of your way. Alright, so now we can actually get the carrier removed from the differential. So there are 4 bolts on either side that need to be broken free. Now an important note, once you get these bolts out and the bearing covers removed and you go to remove the differential, there are shims on either side of the differential and you want to keep those marked and labeled for the correct side that they go back onto. So I use a pry bar here to pry the carrier out. Then you can use a dead blow to remove the pinion. Alright, sorry about the lighting here, but I'm just removing the pinion seal. So I've got that pulled out. Just use my seal puller to remove that, and the outer pinion bearing is just floating in there then, so that can be removed. Now I'll move around to the front. I'll use a long punch to drive that outer race out for the outer pinion bearing, and then come back around and drive out the inner race for the inner pinion bearing. Alright, so next I need to remove the inner axle seals for the differential. So I get a long dowel rod and use a seal driver to knock those both out, and they actually drive towards the center of the differential. See the seal there? It's been completely removed. And now with everything out of the differential, you want to give it a really good cleaning. And I did this probably 3 or 4 times before I started putting stuff back into the differential. So use some brake cleaner, clean the differential out really well, get any debris that's left over out of there. Alright, so I'm reusing my carrier, so I've got to get these bearings pulled off of it. If you got a brand new carrier, you don't have to worry about this. Pretty much what I've done is use this bearing puller and started tightening it up in an alternating fashion and then stacking shims as I get that bearing moving up to get it pulled away from the carrier. So you can see as I've gone along, I actually got to the point where I could fit small like 7/16 nuts between the puller and the bearing, and then eventually I got it completely removed off of there. So this is a little trick to get the bearing pulled off without marring up the carrier shaft. And if you don't have one of the pullers, you can rent one of those from a local auto parts store. Alright, so with that bearing off, I broke all of the bolts free that hold the carrier ring gear in place. So don't completely remove them, just get them loosened up, and then take a mallet and knock that carrier gear until you get it broken free. You can see here all of the bolts have dropped. The gear has moved away from the carrier itself. Then you can come back through and remove all of the bolts, and just remember they are reverse thread. Alright, now just to show how I install the new bearings, I do have a press. So pretty much get them in place, lube up the carrier shaft, and then just press them until they are fully engaged on the shaft. Alright, so now here's where we switch over into build up of the differential. So I'm cleaning things out again, as you can see, before I start installing the new components. And the first thing I'm going to do is install those axle seals, lubricating them up with some gear oil, starting to get them in place. Then I'll use a seal driver and a mallet to tap it in to get started. And then I'll use my long dowel rod here with the seal driver, and I will come and finish it off, knocking it all the way in. And you might have to check it a few times to make sure you've got it fully seated in there. Same thing on the other side, get the seal in place. Use your driver to tap it in. Get your long dowel rod. Here I actually have a metal dowel rod that I'm using. And use the driver to get them fully seated in. Next I'm going to install the inner and outer races for the pinion bearing. So here I take my seal driver and I'm driving in that inner race. You want to keep a close eye on this as you're driving it in. You'll notice a tone change once it's fully seated in place. And then I'll come around to the back side here. Same thing. So this is that outer bearing seal. Use my driver to drive that all the way in. You see that seat in there. Alright, now I'm going to start build up of the carrier. So what I did is I put the ring gear in the oven at 450 degrees for about 30 minutes. That expands out that ring gear enough to where you can get clearance to put it on your carrier. So I did that, pulled it straight out of the oven. I had the carrier itself in the freezer. So put it on there while it's still hot, you get it in place, and then you can start some of your ring gear bolts. And what I'm doing here is I'm Loctiting each of these, some red Loctite, and then I'm marking them as I go around, just to keep track of which ones I've Loctited and torqued. And I'll continue this process really in this alternating fashion. And just as a note, each of these bolts get torqued down to 65 foot-pounds. I usually do this in a two-step fashion, so I'll tighten them up to about 30 foot-pounds in this alternating method. Then I'll come back through and do a second sweep and torque them up to the 65 foot-pounds. Alright, now this is a very important step of this process. So this shim here is your pinion bearing shim that really sets the depth of your pinion. Let me show you exactly what you're looking for here when you go to set up your gears before I get into this. So really what you're looking at is for the contact pattern between your ring gear and your pinion gear to be really centered on the ring gear teeth when you look at that contact pattern. You can see at the top there that ideal contact pattern really has the pattern is centralized on the ring gear. It's not too close to the toe or the heel, so the toe is the inside of the ring gear. The heel is the outside of the ring gear. You want it very much centralized. You can set it up in more of a competition contact, and that's what you see there in the bottom photo, which would be closer to the toe than it is to the heel. You really don't want your contact pattern to be out towards the heel of the ring gear. So you can see this is kind of what you're looking for when you go to set this up. Now this is something that you can run into if your pinion depth is not set properly when you go to reinstall your ring gear and pinion gear in the differential. So you can see a high contact means that the pattern is too close to the crown of the ring gear. So it's almost coming off of the edge of the ring gear, versus the low contact where the pattern is at the root and it's pushing too far into that ring gear. which you really don't want either of these. You want your pattern to be centered on the teeth. If not, you're going to have a noisy gear set, premature wear, and ultimately failure of the gear set if it's not set up properly. So incorrect pinion depth will ultimately cause these two issues. And there are some tools out there if you're getting a brand new differential and setting things up for the first time ever that you can use. You know, that there is a pinion depth gauge that you can use to help you figure out for an initial build how to set up your pinion depth, because otherwise it's really a guessing game here. The one good thing is if you are setting up a pinion on a differential that has already been ran previously, you have a good known depth, then that gives you a good starting point for placing that shim underneath your inner pinion bearing. So pretty much I removed the old bearing, took the shim off my old pinion, and that's what I am using for the initial setup of my differential. Now, once I get into this, it's possible that because I'm putting new ring gear, new pinion gear into this, that I might have to adjust that slightly, but this at least gives me a good starting spot to figure out if I need to make adjustments. So you can see that here. This is that shim that I took off the old pinion gear, and I'm going to be installing it on this one for my initial setup. Now the other thing that I did is the inside of this pinion bearing I ground out until I got enough clearance to where I could install this without having to press it into place, because it's possible that when I go to assemble this, I'm going to have to take it back apart. So I ground that out. It's not the bearing I'll be using for final install, but just for setup. Here I'm installing my crush sleeve. I ordered quite a few of these just to have some spares, just in case I get into this and I have to take it back apart. Because once you use those, they're done. So you need at minimum 2 crush sleeves, probably more, and you need a setup bearing and your final install bearing. Alright, so with the shim, the bearing, and the crush sleeve in place, I've got the outer races in place. You can slide the pinion into the differential. Make sure your outer bearing is in, get your yoke on, and then you can install your pinion yoke wrench adapter. You want to get all 4 bolts installed. Get your breaker bar in place, and then you can go and start tightening this up. Now this is going to take a lot of torque to get this thing set, because you've got to get that crush sleeve to start to compress in order to get the correct rotational drag on that pinion yoke. So I mean, I'm talking like several hundred foot-pounds of torque it's going to take before this thing fully seats and starts to crush. So you'll sit and tighten on this for a while, and you've got to be very careful to check the rotational drag on this pinion yoke in between torquing it down. The GM spec for this is the rotational torque should be between 14 and 19 inch-pounds. So you can see here I've got the beam style torque wrench, and you've got to read what the dynamic torque is on this, not the static torque, so not the torque that it takes to initially start movement, but get the yoke spinning and read where that torque is, or that drag is, and it should be between 14 to 19 inch-pounds. And you can see here I removed it, I'm tightening it down again, and I'll come back and double check that I've got enough on there. But this is like a iterative process where you're putting a little bit of torque on that pinion nut, and then you're rotating and checking to see if you're within the spec range for that rotational drag. Once you've got everything within spec, you can remove that adapter yoke tool, and then you can go around to the other side and get your carrier set in place. So this is where it's critical to make sure that you have the correct shims in the correct location for where you pulled them out initially. I'm going back with the stock carrier, so I'm using the same shims, the same carrier shims on either side as what was in there from the factory. Now, in general, when you go to install these carrier shims, you're not going to be able to just simply slide them into place. So you can see I installed the one shim on the right. Now I'm pulling the bearing cap back off on the left, and I'm going to put that left shim in, and I'm going to use a hammer and a punch to drive that into place. And it's gonna take some force because this is preloading that carrier, preloading the carrier bearings is what you're doing with this. So you've got to you're gonna have to use a hammer, smack that in until you drive it to where it's all the way flush, and then once it's flush, you can come in and install your bearing caps. Now going back to our images here. Just to really show you what you're doing by shimming that carrier either to the left or to the right. So as we talked about earlier, you really want that contact pattern to be centered on the ring gear. And what can happen is if you shim the carrier either too far to the right or too far to the left, you'll have what's called heel contact or toe contact. And you can see those depicted here. So with heel contact, you can see the pattern is really concentrated towards the heel of the ring gear. And when this happens, it means that the ring gear is too far away from that pinion. So the ring gear needs to be shimmed closer to the pinion, and that'll get your contact pattern more centered. And then with toe contact, it's just the opposite. So the ring gear is too close to the pinion and you need to shim it away from the pinion to back off a little bit on that clearance to help get the contact pattern centered. So really that's what you're doing with these shims. And generally what I'd recommend for somebody that's coming into this for the first time is use the factory shim stack when you go to install your carrier to at least kind of get you in the ballpark. And then from there you can paint your gears, look at your contact pattern, and make adjustments based off of where you are using the factory shim stack. And this is probably one of the toughest things about setting up gears like this. There really isn't a one-size-fits-all setup. It really takes a little bit of setup, understanding where you are, and then making adjustments based off of that, and understanding that each adjustment you make is going to impact one of the other readings that you're going to get. So for example, say that you get your contact pattern centered, but your pinion is contacting too much at the root or too much at the crown, and you've got to go and adjust your pinion depth. Once you go back and change your pinion depth, you may no longer, with the same exact carrier shims, be centered on your ring gear, and you're going to have to come back and make adjustments. So it's an iterative process. You're going back and forth with making small adjustments until you get everything within spec based on what the manufacturer calls out for that specific differential, and it will be different depending on your setup and what you're installing. So back to the setup here. Now that I've got both of my factory shims in place, I'm going to come back and install the bearing caps and get these tightened down. And I like to torque these down in a crisscross sequence. So you'll notice I'll go through and snug all of these up, and then when I come back to torque it, I will torque in an alternating fashion. And the final torque spec on these bolts for the bearing caps is 60 foot-pounds. So I'll kind of step that up and come through twice. The first time going to 30-ish foot-pounds, and then the second time doing the 60 foot-pounds. Now, the next step before we paint our gears is we've got to use our dial indicator to check the backlash on the ring gear. So you see here I'm setting up the dial indicator. I've got a magnetic base that's attached to the differential. You want to get this thing set. I'll zero it out, and then really what you're doing is you're looking at the total movement of the ring gear back and forth where it's not contacting the pinion, or from contact to contact pretty much. It's the amount of float in the gear. And you want to check this at several spots along the ring gear, not just at a single tooth. So I'll go around to a few teeth and I will check this, and the spec from GM calls out 6 to 10 thousandths of an inch of backlash between your ring gear and your pinion. And I'm sitting right about at 7 thousandths at each spot that I've checked. You can see here I'm going between 8 and 15 thou. So that's right on spec. So with that falling within spec, I can go through and clean some of the gear teeth. That way I've got a clean spot that I can apply the gear marking compound. And generally what I'll do here is I'll go through and mark 4 or 5 teeth. And this stuff goes quite a long ways, so you don't have to use very much. You put just a small amount on there and it will it'll cover the entire tooth. And then another important note is make sure that you're getting the marking compound on both the drive and coast side of the gear, because you're going to want to look at the pattern on both sides. So once this is done, I'll go through and rotate it against the pinion. That way I can see what the contact pattern looks like. Alright, so here I've got it all completely marked. I'll rotate it around. I'll reach around and put tension on that pinion as I go back and forth. That way I get a good contact impression on the ring gear, and then I'll bring it back around here to take a look at it. Alright, so this is our first pass. This is the drive side here, and you can see it actually is very centered with the stock setup on the gear teeth. And the coast side is pretty centered as well. It's not as concerning either on the coast side. I mean, you of course want the gears, the impressions to be centered regardless, but it looks really good on the drive side. You can see that here. Maybe a hair close to the crown of the gear, but for the most part, that's really good. So I can go ahead at this point and pull this back apart, and especially for it being a front differential, I'm only going to run in 4-wheel drive. I can pull everything back apart and set up for my final install. So that's what I'm doing here. Pull the bearing caps back off. I'm going to have to pry the carrier back out. Come around to the back side here, break my pinion nut loose again, and get that pulled completely off. I'll put the old nut back on here and use a mallet to knock that pinion out. Then I can go around to the other side, pull the pinion out, make sure my outer bearing doesn't fall, so I'll pull that out. And then I take this over to the press, and I'm going to press the actual inner pinion bearing that I'm going to run onto the pinion itself. So that's what I'm doing here. I've got the shim that I used for stack up in place, and this is final setup. This is why for the last time when I was doing my initial setup, I ground out the inside of that setup bearing. That way I could easily pull it on and off, because I didn't want to have to press it in place, and then it's a pain in the ass getting that thing pulled back off. So now that I know my setup's good, my pinion depth was good, I can go and install my actual pinion bearing, the inner pinion bearing that I'm going to run with the setup, which is what I did here. And with this pressed into place, now I'm ready to go. I can install a brand new crush sleeve, I can get my pinion seal installed, and I can get things set up for the final time and do a final checkout. So that's what I'm doing here. I'll take my pinion seal and I'll get that in place. I'll use my seal driver to knock that in to where it's flush. And just remember, your outer pinion bearing has to go in before that. So I didn't show that in the video, but my outer pinion bearing is already in there before I drove that seal in. And now here I've reinstalled my pinion with crush sleeve, and I'm going through and tightening it up. And you can see this, I mean, this takes a lot of force to get this crush sleeve to start crushing and to get it within the rotational drag spec that that GM calls out. So I use a long breaker bar. Makes it even harder because I'm working on the garage floor. I don't have it in the air, so I'm pretty much bench pressing the breaker bar there to get that torque spec where it needs to be. And I'm not showing every step of the process here, but I'm making very small changes, and then I'm checking that rotational torque to make sure it's within spec, because you can overshoot that and then the crush sleeve is done and you have to disassemble everything, remove the crush sleeve, and start all over. So make sure you're checking this iteratively as you go through and tighten this down. And then once you have it within spec, you can come back. I'm putting some gear oil on my bearing faces there before I do my final install. See, I'm setting the carrier in place. I've got that shim on the right hand side, shoving the one into the left there, and then I'm going to drive that in with a large mallet and a punch. And I'm well aware they have a tool. I've got one actually for installing these shims. I just did not have it handy. And you can do this with a punch. You just have to be careful not to mar up your shim, because that'll change your backlash, your preload, your ring gear set. So you got to be very careful as you're installing this not to gum up that shim to where it impacts your overall setup. Now I'm coming back through, reinstalling my bearing caps. I'll get these things tightened up, and then I'll come through and retorque all four of those bolts down to 60 foot-pounds. So that's your final install torque and your setup torque. You want things to be exactly the same. So when you go to finish this off, you want to torque to 60 foot-pounds. And I've always thrown just a dab of blue Loctite on these before I install these. I don't think anything specifically calls that out, but I do it just for security. So I didn't get a video last night because it was getting too dark, so I came back the next day here and I'd already painted the teeth and checked my backlash. You can see there I'm still right about at 7 thou, which is right within spec of what you want, 6 to 10 thou backlash. And once again, I'll check this at a few spots just to confirm that it's good all the way around. Sometimes you can have a weird offset and something's up where one of your teeth is out of spec. Now I'll go back through, I'll paint again just so you can kind of see the process here. But paint both sides of the teeth, rotate it around, grab that pinion yoke, put some tension on there, and that way you get a good impression. And then this is the coast side, and that's the drive side there. And you can see I'm centered on the tooth. I'm not focused on too much to the toe or too much to the heel on either side. You can see the impressions here as well, so it's It's very centered. Everything looks good. I'm ready to start installing everything. So now I'll come out to the driver's side, insert the axle shaft back into place. And once I have that in place with the seal, you can see the outer seal there. Put a little bit of grease on that. Get my spindle installed. I'll use the nuts that hold this in place to kind of tighten it down. I'll do this in a crisscross pattern as I'm going around, just to make sure it seats evenly all the way around. So I'm doing that here with an impact. And then once that spindle's fully seated, I'll pull these nuts back off because the brake splash shield or dust shield has to be installed over top of this. So I'll come back in, install that, make sure you have it in the right orientation so that the caliper can go back in place. And then I put a dab of Loctite in each one of these nuts, and they get torqued down to 120 inch-pounds. And while I had this dust shield off, I went ahead and put it in the blaster just to sandblast it down, and took some epoxy and painted it, and then came back through and put some black gloss paint on there just to finish it off. That way it didn't look rusted sitting there. So I got the rest of that old grease off of the spindle. I shoved some new grease up inside the rotor before I put it on, and then came back and filled the inside with some additional grease. Then you want to go and screw on your inner spindle lock nut, and this thing has a very specific torquing sequence in order to get the proper preload on the wheel bearing. So what you want to do is take your torque wrench when you're installing this, and you want to rotate the rotor, spin the rotor as you're tightening. Torque this inner spindle nut down to 50 foot-pounds initially. Then back off of that, and as you're spinning the rotor again, retorque it down to 35 foot-pounds. And then once you've torqued it a second time at 35 foot-pounds, you want to back off an additional quarter turn, and then you can install your outer washer. So that is a very specific torque sequence for that inner spindle nut. And then once you get that washer installed, you can see I'm installing that now. Once that's installed, you want to torque the outer spindle nut to 160 to 200 foot-pounds. And really, so that inner spindle nut is really what's setting the preload on your wheel bearings. This outer nut is what locks the inner nut in place. So that kind of keeps it from breaking loose, because it doesn't have a ton of torque on that inner spindle nut. I mean, 35 foot-pounds isn't that much. All right, next your outer washer goes in place. Then you've got your snap ring, which you can slide on to lock that all into position. And then once that's in there, I throw some more grease in, and then here's the auto locking hub assembly. Got to make sure you got those two ears of that assembly lined up where they should go. And then you can see I'm compressing those two ears and pushing that in. And then this is the cap that goes on to lock that all in place. Now here's the seal for the dust cap, and then the actual dust caps going into place now. And of course these bolts don't need a ton of torque. I mean, really just snug them up. It's just the dust cap, so it's not actually holding anything in place, just keeping contaminants and stuff out of your rotor assembly. And once you've got these snugged up, make sure you clean your rotor really good, get any grease off of that before you go and reinstall your brake caliper. And that's what I'm doing here. You can see I'm getting that back down on the rotor and installing those bolts. I do put a dab of Loctite on these, just blue Loctite. And then these get torqued down to about 25 to 30 foot-pounds. Now on the other side, process is the same, so I'll just speed through this pretty quickly. Alright, now with everything else installed, I went ahead and put my new cover on the differential with a brand new gasket. And you can see now I'm filling the differential with gear oil. This is 80W90 gear oil that I'm filling it with. And really, all that you want to do here is continue to fill the differential until you get a drip that starts to come out of that fill port. You see that there? That means that you are full and install your cap, and the differential is ready to test. And you don't have to go crazy when tightening this thing up. I mean, get it snugged down, but these covers are, especially this one's thinner gauge metal, so you could easily strip out or deform that cover by going too tight with it. Alright, now the last thing I got to do before I can actually drive on this is reinstall my tie rod. So you can see I brought that back in. I get it started there on the driver's side, take the nut off of that stabilizer arm and get it started. Then I'll go over to the passenger side, lift it up there through the steering knuckle, get the nut started, and then you just got to go around and torque all of these down. And these ball joints at the end of each of the tie rod ends gets torqued down to 45 foot-pounds, and then that steering stabilizer gets torqued down to 35 foot-pounds. And once you have everything torqued, don't forget to reinstall your cotter pin in all of these castle nuts. Alright, and with all of that done, now you are ready to test drive. I hope this video was helpful to some of you guys. I know this process can be kind of intimidating, but you just have to take your time, make sure you get things set up properly. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them below, and please like and subscribe to the channel for future content. Thanks.